Paul Katie, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Give the government some confidence. Think about the economy more broadly going well for China. The more interesting story is you look at TSMC.
Hi, I'm Paul Katie from East Asia Econ. We're a specialist research firm looking at the economies of Japan, China, Taiwan, and Korea. I'm here today to talk about data. And one of the things I want to address in this is sort of two things, really. One, there is this sort of growing debate, growing angst about China, and that China is somehow becoming more difficult to analyse, and deliberately so from the government's point of view, because they're making this data disappear sort of in order to make people less aware of the economic problems that China might be having. So I think that's kind of in the ether of people are discussing about China. The second thing is to talk about the data in more broader terms. And I think related to that, and kind of there's a few points I want to make. The one, I think that first thing isn't really true, right? Like, I mean, data is always difficult in China, to be frank. I think there's very little evidence that there's a lot of data disappearing, and I certainly don't think there's very good evidence that the data is disappearing in order to make it more difficult to discover what's happening. Or at least if that is the case, the government is doing a terrible job, because we all know a lot of the economic problems that China has. So I think that's one thing I want to talk about. Another thing I want to say is that it seems to me that, like, in a sense, people are a little bit too lazy around the way that they analyze and they look at data in China, even some of the professionals. And actually, there are some basic things that people could be doing to improve their understanding and improve all of our understandings, really, of what's really happening in China's economy, particularly in terms of short-term economic momentum. The third thing, then, is to kind of provide you with some tools and with something which might be helpful for everybody watching this in terms of better ways to understand the economy and better ways to track what's going on. And a lot of that is related to the kind of the work that we do at East Asia Econ, where we do track a lot of data and we do process a lot of data and try to present that in ways which are both useful and interesting to people looking at these economies. So the first thing, right, this issue that I know it's becoming, the data is disappearing from China, and that data disappearance is sort of a deliberate act from the government in order to make it more difficult to understand the economic problems that China is having. Now, like as I said, I think that I find it difficult to understand that that's what's happening. And you know, why is, well, first of all, I think it's maybe a way to explain that is to explain what I've been doing over the course of the last few years. So I've worked in different financial sector industry jobs on the sell side and on the buy side. Like I was head of China economics at Macquarie for a while. I lived in Beijing. I then worked at Wellington Management, which is a large asset management company, where I was looking at macro across the region. So, you know, China and Japan and Korea in particular. Now, since leaving those jobs like a few years ago, I spent a bit of time back in Chinese school. But the other thing I've been doing is spending an inordinate amount of time trying to build a data infrastructure for collecting and processing data about the Asian economies. The reason for doing this is because, you know, like the idea of Econ is to provide sort of good quality economic analysis, particularly to financial institutions. So the kind of clients I have on the asset management side and in hedge funds, trying to provide good quality data as a sort of fundamental input for the analysis that we try to do about the direction of these economies. So the point being, I think you can't really do, at least, you know, my angle or my approach to trying to understand these economies is to try to understand, get good data sets to get a good understanding of actually what is going on in order to paint a picture of where these economies might go in the future. Now, to do that, you need to collect a lot of data. And what I've realized over the course of the last 3 to 4 years is, you know, when you're in big institutions, you tend to have access to a lot of data through databases. So that might be Bloomberg, it might be CIC. For China, a lot of it comes through Wind. These are very useful resources. They have thousands of pieces of data you can look at, and it's quite easily available. So if you want to get, you know, China's exports to Albania, as an example, it's quite easy to do that from one of these data sets in the case of a minute or so. So what I've been trying to do, sort of naively, I think, when I look back on it, is try to build all of that, but on my own. And the reason for doing that is to try to control the data so that it's easier for me then to use the data to be able to provide it to other people, which is something I'll talk about later in the course of this video. But the other thing I think it has given me is a very good understanding of the data that is published and of the difficulties of getting that. And so I think there's a few things to kind of be saying about that. So let's start with one other things here. And that is this idea that China somehow is managing to, for example, hide the fact that the property market is very weak. So some of the data related to the property market, it does seem that the government has stopped publishing that over the course of the last couple of years. Like, I really think this isn't relevant. This isn't important at all. The reason for saying that is because there's so much other data that says that the property market really has collapsed. And so to give you an example on that, we can look at least three different sources. So the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of China, they publish a lot of data on lending to the real estate sector. So we get good data every month on mortgages, how much lending is going to households in order to buy property. We get quarterly data on how much the industry as a whole is lending to the real estate sector. There's different, we can look at interest rates in the People's Bank of China in terms of mortgage rates. Like, there's different stuff that comes out from that side. The second source of data is the National Bureau of Statistics in China. So the main statistical agency. They have a monthly release about what's happening with construction and property market related developments. Now, that is a very big data series, right? Like, it's not just one. There's lots of different data about properties under the amount of property being started, the amount of property under construction, the amount of property being finalized across different types of property, whether that be commercial, residential, or factories, and then different kinds of classes of property. So different sort of areas where it's being sold within the country. So there's a ton of data there. The third source that we have is private sector data. So there's a lot of data from, because these days, like over the course of the last, if you go back and think about 2005 or thereabouts, it was much more difficult to get this sort of data. But now there's weekly data on the amount of property being sold in China. There's monthly data from private sector providers about what's happening with property prices. Like, there's a ton of data out there. So some data sources, yes, some data series may have disappeared. But from my perspective, my bigger problem with looking at China is I'm always drowning in data. Like, there's tons of it around. The more difficult thing is making sense of that data and building a picture. Now, if we think about something like the property market, in fact, it's relatively easy because pretty much all of it points in the same direction. It's all saying that property has collapsed over the course of the last 5 years. That's true even in terms of the official data. So if we look at these data from the National Bureau of Statistics that talk about what's happening with property starts in China, like how much property is being started every month, like that's down about 50% from the peak. Like, that's sort of something which most economists prior to 2020 would have said is unimaginable, like in the sense that would have too big an impact on the economy and therefore it's something that was very unlikely to happen. That's in the data that is published. So I have a hard time sort of thinking that actually data disappearing really is a big problem. Now, like, I don't want to dismiss it entirely as a concept in the way that we understand China more broadly. So I do understand in some of from academics that some specific databases have become very difficult for foreigners in particular to access. So this isn't a broad point about Xi Jinping's China. It's not a broad point about the availability of data on China in a general sense. But I think specifically when we're thinking about the economy and thinking about some of the big changes that have happened in the economy over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, this isn't something really to get too worked up about. Like, it's not a big problem when we come to look at the economy. And I think one of the other problems with this is this kind of focus on arguing that data is disappearing and it's obscuring our understanding of the economy, is it sort of puts less pressure on China to, it distracts from where there really are issues with the economic data. And that, I think, is, and to my mind, that's the bigger issue. It's not so much that the data is going backwards. The bigger issue is that data is not going forwards. So, there's not enough improvement in the way that China is presenting the data. So, why would I say that? Because China now, particularly in terms of the big urban areas, and if you look at its military capability as an example, or if you look at what's happening in the tech sector, it's clear that China's technology capability, its capability is very high. The resources that the government can muster are substantial. And yet some of the very basic stuff that you would expect in terms of the data that you need to analyze what's happening is not available. So some obvious examples in that. When you look at elsewhere in the world, when you try to calculate, if you look at the consumer price index, the consumer price index, so inflation, right, ends up with one number, the percentage change each year in the price level. To get that number is based on a basket of 500 or more different products. So it's measuring different prices across different products the prices of those different products, or those different products are weighted, and then that weighted index is joined together to produce that one number, which is the inflation rate. So obviously very important in that process is knowing the weights. You need to, so to be able to calculate what the different contribution of products is to the inflation process, you need to know what the weights are. In China, those weights are very difficult to get hold of. Like, they're not transparent. The same is true in terms of the weights, in terms of what produces industrial production, the industrial production index. Again, the weights aren't there. Another problem, when you look at people forecasting China's economic, so you'll see that Bloomberg and Reuters and the other agencies, like, they'll ask everybody, all the economists on the sell side in particular, like what their forecasts are for the economy, for these big aggregate numbers, like what's happening with retail sales, what's happening with industrial production, what's happening with GDP, right? They want to know what the market thinks the economy is doing. Now, that as a general principle is very reasonable, right? Like, you want to know, is the economy getting worse or getting better relative to where forecasts are? That's important for market sentiment. It's important for understanding, is the economy accelerating or slowing down? The problem in China is there's nothing to found those forecasts on, particularly if you think about something like GDP. And so GDP, we can get some sense from the production side of the economy what's happening with GDP each quarter. But one of the things that China very much lacks is a quarterly breakdown of expenditure on GDP that is like the bread and butter, like the very basics of something that we've provided in another economy. And it seems very unlikely that China, with its capabilities these days, doesn't have the capacity to be able to produce those data. It's just not something that's in the public domain. And so I think one of the problems with kind of focusing on the fact that some data series are disappearing, is that it misses the fact that the bigger problem in China is that a lot of the data stuff isn't really improving. Now, the third thing I want to talk about in terms of the data side is sort of data availability. And that's kind of to think about not just China, but what's happening, like, kind of relative to the rest of the region. And again, this is sort of like a third thing in terms of playing down some of the difficulties in following China, compared with some of the media reports that come out about this disappearing data. So when I look at the data, and again, my process is to try to collect data from the sources. So I go to the central bank websites, I go to the statistical websites of the government agencies in each country and try to get the data directly and process it from there. I'm not relying on paid databases to get that. And in that process, I can tell you it's much easier to get data from China's statistical agency than it is, for example, from the statistical agency in Korea. It's easier to get the data from China in some ways than it is to get the data from Japan. The best economy in this sense is Taiwan, where they make it very simple for people to access the data and to be able to download the data in a very easy way. So again, like, even on this perspective, when we think about sort of data availability, like, it's not at all clear to me that China is particularly bad relative to other countries in the region. I would say that there is one point that's worth stressing about the sort of data availability, and it kind of reflects like one of the biases, I think, or one of the understandings that people have about the different agencies within China. And that's that, like, the People's Bank of China, the central bank, is much more sort of open, it's much more market friendly, it provides data in a much easier to understand way. That's just not true. Like, it's much easier to get data from the National Bureau of Statistics and to understand that data than it is from the People's Bank of China. Like, as an example, the People's Bank does publish annual data on, like, it publishes monthly data on what's happening, for example, in loans. But there's nowhere on the website that you can get a long time series of loan growth over the course of the last 20 years or so, which is, from an economic perspective, what you'd really be interested in. What you have to do instead is download each year individually and then piece it all together. A lot of the data on the People's Bank of China, when they release data every month, the data isn't published in Excel. It's published just in terms of a press release where you have to pick out the data and then push it into an Excel sheet yourself. So, like, it's not that, I think, again, when you think about the data issues in China, there are data issues. I think they're just very different from the data issues that are now being commonly followed in terms of the media and what's happening with those. So that's kind of the first thing, just to kind of like get a sense of, where we are with the data, what some of the problems are in China relative to the other economies, and what some of the problems aren't. Now, I said, like, one of the things I was going to talk about was, what we do at East Asia Econ. And as I said, I spend far too much time, frankly, trying to learn Python and build this data infrastructure. I think it is working reasonably well now. It still can be frustrating as hell at some points, but I think overall it is working, in a fairly smooth way these days. And so it's becoming much more useful. Now, why is that useful for you? like for people watching this. So if you think again about China, like as the easiest example here, but some of this criticism or some of these observations also apply to the economies in the rest of the region. So one of the peculiarities of China is that some of the data is published in year-to-date form. So usually what you're looking for as an economist, like particularly if you're looking to understand cycles which tend to move in terms of months rather than years, you want to know what happened in May, relative to what happened in April. The way some of the data in China is published is this is what happened in January to April. It's not published in terms of April itself. So now, like the obvious thing then is, okay, well, you can just calculate it, right? Because we have the year-to-date data to March, and then we have the year-to-date data to April, and April is just the difference between those two things. That's an obvious, easier change to make. It is still astounding, really, that you see some charts, even from big financial institutions, that show charts of the year-to-date. And the year-to-date number obviously looks like it's just like this sort of zigzag shape over the course of years. It's really not useful. So, and this is no great boast, but one of the things that we do on East Asia Econ is, first of all, to change that. So all the data we have is in monthly form. It's much more usable. The second thing, which is more substantial, is to seasonally adjust that data. So if you think about how economies work, well, let's say in terms of consumption, right? So what tends to happen with consumption is people buy a lot of coats in the winter, and they buy T-shirts in the summer. So if you're using coats as an example, or purchases of clothing in general, you end up with these very big seasonal patterns. So when you compare, say, January with February, there might be a big change in that in terms of February fell from January. But if that happens every year, that's not informative, right? That's not telling you anything about what's happening with the economy today. It's telling you what happens to the economy every year in February, because there's been a weather change, or there's been a holiday, or there's been a habit in the way people change. That means every February retail sales fall compared with January. So historically in China, and in some of the economies, but particularly in China, like this sort of monthly stuff didn't make too much difference. All you needed to do was to look at the year-on-year change. So you're looking at February this year compared with February last year. And obviously if you do that, you get away from that seasonal change from January through to February. That, though, these days is much less useful. And the reason for that is because when the economy is stable, when the year-on-year growth doesn't change over time, and if you look at any of the data sort of before COVID in China, like retail sales is sort of 8% every year forever, right? So then small changes around the 8% are quite significant in how we should understand the economy. But since COVID, there's huge changes from month to month. So that year-on-year, like that base effect is no longer stable. And therefore, it's no longer good enough just to look on year-on-year data. We have to be looking at the month-on-month change to understand really what's happening with the economy. Now, again, to look at the month-on-month change, it's no good just looking at the headline data published by the government, because in China, that tends not to be seasonally adjusted. It tends not to adjust for that change in purchasing pattern that happens every year between January and February. So there's a very simple statistical process that you can do, which seasonally adjusts the data, which means then you have, like, you can either look at in level terms, or you look at the month-on-month change, and that becomes much more informative in understanding where we are with the current cycle. So here, like East Asia Econ, some very basic things we do with the data. One is you get rid of that year-to-date stuff. The second, you do a seasonally adjustment, and so there's seasonally adjusted data is all available. There's two other things I think are sort of useful about what we do or what I do. So as part of this process of processing all of the data, like we work out like sort of very standard ratios in terms of what's useful to be looking at. So for example, we might saying the trade surplus in China is $100 billion US, like it sounds big, but is it really that big? What you really want to be looking at is that relative to the size of the economy. Like, is it large as a percentage of GDP, or is it small? Now again, like you can take the data from the National Bureau of Statistics, you can take the data from the Customs Service in China, which is where the trade data is published. You can then go to the National Bureau of Statistics website and get the GDP number, and you can work out the ratio yourself. That takes time for people. So one of the things we have on the website is all of that is available as available in terms of standard. And then the final thing, which I think is helpful in this, is to build regional context, right? So you're not just looking, you can look at China, you can look at developments in Japan relative to their own history, but often what's useful is to be looking at what's happening relative to other economies. And one of the things I think that particularly stands out here in thinking about East Asia is to include Taiwan in that process. And so this is one of the peculiarities, both of Taiwan and of sort of this region, in that Taiwan is one of the most successful economies, like in East Asia over the course of the last 40 years, right? Like it has a standard of living now, which is higher than Korea and it's higher than Japan and continues to increase very quickly. And yet, if you look at most of the international databases, like I'm reading a book by like Kenneth Rogoff, right? This book about the US dollar, right? And in that, it talks a bit about Korea and he talks a bit about Japan in terms of developments in East Asia. He never talks about Taiwan. And maybe he doesn't think Taiwan is important. But I think one of the reasons Taiwan tends to get ignored in a lot of these international comparisons is because the IMF doesn't really publish data on what's happening in Taiwan. Like it's not in the UN, it's not in the IMF, it's not in the World Bank. You get some data from the Bank of International Settlements, particularly on exchange rates, which is very useful. But in general, there isn't much international data about Taiwan. So when people do these international comparisons and say, what's happening with economies, how do economies break out of the middle income trap and so on, like Taiwan is very rarely included in those comparisons because it's difficult to get, it's easy to get the data for Taiwan. It's much easier to get the data for 120 other economies because you go to the World Bank website and do it that way. So one of the other things I think is an advantage or perhaps useful in our approach is that Taiwan is included in all of these things. And so there's comparable data in what's happening with Taiwan and what's happening with Korea, or what's happening in Taiwan today, what happened in Taiwan like 20 years ago compared with what's happening in mainland China today, for example. So all of the things are clear. And so, so to bring that all together and think about this data stuff, like what's helpful about what we're doing. So we have all of that stuff, but it's also available. So we make it available in two forms. So first of all, like on the website, there's a bunch of, we have country or economy websites. And on each of those pages for each of the economy, there's a bunch of charts. Those charts are updated whenever new data is published. Like they show a lot of the kind of relationships which are useful for people in financial industry. So, for example, looking at the yen against interest rate differentials, looking at sort of prices in Korea, inflation in Korea relative to prices from the Bank of Korea Business Sentiment Survey. These sort of things which kind of give you a sense of where these big economic data points might be going over the course of the next 6 months. That's all available on the website and it's all updated in a cleaned up form. So you can look, for example, when CPI data is published in China, you can look on our website and you can get like a chart of the month-to-month change in core CPI, which isn't so everybody's taste. But I think for anybody who wants to understand really what's happening with the economy, that's a much better look at what's going on rather than using the headline year-on-year change in total CPI, which is a thing that most of the media focus on. The other thing is all of that data is available to be downloaded in the charts. And we've also been working on this data download app where you can go and chart specific data points for all of these different things I've been talking about. So again, the data is cleaned up. It's in a much more useful form and it's also ready available to be able to use. And I think all of those three things, it's much more difficult to find that in sort of like most of the standard things that are used for data. So today what I've talked about is some of the issues with data. So just to recap on that, I think like we have to be careful about some of these criticisms that are made about Chinese data. Like there are issues with the data in China. I just think they're not really the data issues that are being talked about at the moment. The second thing is when we talk about availability of data generally in the region, China doesn't actually look that bad relative to other economies. Like, it's more difficult in some ways to get data from other places. The third thing is then like in terms of what we do and what might be helpful to you is when you try to understand these economies, I think the data we have and the data we've collected and processed is like, it's pretty good quality and probably much more useful than a lot of stuff you can find if you just generally go and look around for the data. And it's very easily available in the charts and on the data that we have. So, if you're interested, certainly I'd encourage you to go and look at that. It's all available at eastasiaecon.com. If you have any suggestions about that, any other additional things you would like to be included in terms of the data, then please get in touch. And if you're interested in subscribing to the analysis that we do, because all of this stuff I've talked about today is really the foundations, right? Like it's the infrastructure. Like the value added that we do is much more the analysis using this data to try to think about what's happening with these economies and where they go. If you're interested in that analysis, then please get in touch with me at paul@eastasiaecon.com. Thanks very much for watching.